Hello and welcome to Nightmare Tales. Today we've got a new series of videos titled Dark Web Stories. I hope you enjoy it. Don't forget to subscribe. It started as a dare. Evan wasn't the type to shy away from a challenge, especially when his friends egged him on. They were bored teens, craving the thrill of the forbidden, and the dark web seemed like the ultimate playground. A world of urban legends where hitmen, cursed artifacts, and unspeakable horrors were supposedly just a click away. But this wasn't Evan's first trip down the rabbit hole. Unlike his friends, he had a knack for finding the obscure corners of the internet, places where the lines between fiction and reality blurred. And this time he found something different. The site was called Santa's Workshop. Its homepage was deceptively cheerful, bright red and green, a whimsical snowman dancing in the corner, and a header in Comic Sans font that read, "Welcome to Santa's List. Have you been naughty or nice?" It looked like a joke, a harmless holiday prank. But as Evan scrolled, his grin faded. The interface was simplistic, a search bar and two buttons, naughty and nice. Curious, he typed in his name and clicked nice. The screen blinked and a cheery message appeared. "Good job, Evan. You've been a good boy this year. Santa's watching." He snorted. Predictable. But then he clicked naughty. The page went black. A loading icon spun in the corner, accompanied by a jarring, distorted jingle. When the screen refreshed, a new message appeared. "Santa knows. Santa always knows." Below it was a list. Evan's list. Every bad thing he'd done, big and small, from stealing money out of his mom's purse to spreading a rumor that got a classmate suspended. Things no one else should have known. He froze, heart pounding. This wasn't possible. At the bottom of the screen, another message blinked in red. "Do you want to see Santa's gift? Accept delivery to continue." He hesitated but clicked anyway. The site asked for his address. The box arrived 2 days later, plain and unmarked, left on his porch while his parents were at work. Evan brought it inside, his hands trembling as he set it on the kitchen counter. He didn't want to open it, not really, but his curiosity burned too brightly to ignore. Using a kitchen knife, he sliced through the tape. Inside was a single item, a hand-carved wooden figure. It was Santa, but not the jolly version from stories and commercials. This Santa was grotesque, his face twisted into a cruel sneer, his eyes black hollows that seemed to follow Evan as he moved. In one hand, he clutched a sack that bulged unnaturally, as if something alive were trapped inside. Attached to the figurine was a card. "You've been naughty, Evan. Santa's coming to check his list. Be ready." Evan's stomach dropped. This was a joke, had to be. His friends must have found the site too, set this up to scare him. But that night, as he lay in bed, he couldn't shake the feeling of those hollow eyes watching him. The first sound came at midnight, the faint clatter of something on the roof. Evan sat up in bed, his heart pounding. He told himself it was just a raccoon, maybe a loose shingle in the wind. But then he heard it again, closer this time. A scraping noise, followed by the creak of footsteps. He grabbed his phone, dialing his dad's number, but the call wouldn't go through. The screen was glitching, the signal replaced with static. Then came the jingle. It wasn't cheerful, not like the ones on Christmas commercials. This was slow, warped, each note dragging like a dirge. He turned toward his bedroom door, just in time to see the handle twist. Evan grabbed the nearest object, a lamp, and held it out like a weapon as the door creaked open. Standing there, filling the doorway, was Santa. But it wasn't a man in a red suit. This Santa was impossibly tall, his frame bending unnaturally to fit through the door. His face was pale, almost corpse-like, with empty eye sockets that oozed black ichor. His sack hung over his shoulder, writhing and squirming as if filled with something alive. He smiled, revealing rows of jagged, yellowed teeth. "You've been naughty," Santa rasped, his voice like rusted metal grinding against itself. "Time for your gift." Evan woke up in darkness, his body aching, his wrists bound. At first, he thought it was a dream, but the cold metal against his skin and the muffled screams nearby told him otherwise. He was in a room, no, a cage, and outside the bars were others like him. Kids, adults, all pale and trembling, their faces streaked with tears. A familiar jingle echoed in the distance, sending shivers down his spine. Santa's workshop wasn't a game. It was real. And he wasn't the only one on the naughty list. Evan's breathing was shallow as he tried to make sense of the scene before him. The dim light overhead flickered, casting jagged shadows across the room. Rows of cages stretched out in all directions, each containing a terrified, hollow-eyed prisoner. Some were silent, curled into themselves, while others whispered in frantic tones, their voices barely audible over the hum of machinery in the background. He strained against the cold metal binding his wrists, but the restraints didn't budge. His fingers were numb, and his heart raced with every passing second. The air reeked of sweat, fear, and something metallic, like blood. Far off, a rhythmic clanging reverberated through the space, growing louder and closer. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't a prank. The sight, the list, the grotesque Santa, all of it was real. A low growl came from somewhere nearby. Evan froze, craning his neck to see beyond the bars of his cage. A figure moved through the shadows, a massive, hulking shape dragging something behind it. The thing's gait was uneven, its limbs long and gangly, scraping against the walls as it passed. It was one of Santa's helpers. The thing stopped at the cage nearest to Evan, crouching with a sickening crunch of bones. Its elongated fingers reached through the bars, gripping the shoulder of a trembling man inside. The man's screams were cut short as the helper yanked him out with terrifying ease. Evan's stomach churned as he watched the man disappear into the darkness, his cries fading into the distance. He had to get out. The chains binding his wrists rattled softly as he shifted, testing their strength. He glanced around his cage, searching for anything that could help him escape. His eyes landed on a jagged piece of metal protruding from the corner of the cage. It was risky, but he didn't have a choice. With painstaking care, he maneuvered himself closer, wincing as the chains bit into his skin. The jagged edge tore at the bindings slowly, each movement sending sharp pains up his arms. Minutes felt like hours, but finally the restraint on one wrist snapped free. His heart pounded as he worked on the other, keeping his movements as quiet as possible. The moment his hands were free, he slumped back against the bars, clutching his bleeding wrists. He needed a plan, needed to figure out where he was and how to get out without attracting the attention of the helpers. A faint rustling sound came from the cage to his left. Evan turned to see a young girl staring at him, her wide eyes filled with fear and desperation. "You're trying to escape," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He nodded, motioning for her to keep quiet. "Take me with you," she pleaded, her small hands gripping the bars of her cage. Evan hesitated. The thought of leaving her behind made his stomach twist, but he didn't know if he could save anyone else. Before he could respond, the clanging footsteps returned, louder and more frantic. The helpers knew someone was loose. Evan pressed a finger to his lips, signaling the girl to stay silent. He crouched low, using the shadows to conceal himself as he examined the lock on his cage door. It was rusted, barely holding together, a small blessing in this nightmare. With a sharp kick, the lock gave way. The door creaked open and Evan slipped out, his bare feet barely making a sound on the cold floor. The girl reached through the bars, her fingers brushing his arm. "Please," she whispered again, tears streaming down her face. Evan's jaw tightened. He couldn't leave her. He knelt by her cage, examining the lock. It was sturdier than his, but the jagged piece of metal he had used earlier might work. He wedged it into the lock, twisting and prying as quietly as he could. The footsteps were getting closer. Just as the lock clicked open, a deafening roar echoed through the room. Evan's blood ran cold as he turned to see one of the helpers charging toward him, its grotesque form illuminated by the flickering light. "Run!" he yelled, pulling the girl out of the cage. She hesitated for a moment, her eyes wide with terror, but then she bolted, following Evan as he sprinted toward the shadows. The room was a labyrinth, filled with cages and machinery that churned and hissed ominously. Evan led the way, his mind racing as he tried to remember the layout of the place. The helpers' guttural growls echoed behind them, growing louder with every step. Evan darted through the maze of cages, his breath ragged and his heart pounding. The girl clung to his arm, her small feet struggling to keep up. The metallic screeches of machinery masked their footsteps, but the guttural growls of the helper were unrelenting, closing in with every turn. He spotted a faint red glow ahead, an emergency exit sign flickering weakly in the darkness. It wasn't much, but it was hope. "This way," he whispered harshly, tugging the girl forward. The helper's enraged roar erupted behind them, accompanied by the crash of metal as it tore through a stack of cages. Evan dared not look back. The sound of its labored, predatory breathing was enough to push him faster, adrenaline coursing through his veins. They rounded a corner and skidded to a halt. Ahead of them was a massive steel door, its frame reinforced and covered in heavy locks. The exit sign was mounted above it, mocking them with its promise of escape. "No. No, no, no," Evan muttered, frantically examining the door. There was no keypad, no visible way to open it, just a set of bolts and chains, impossible to break through with their bare hands. The girl tugged at his sleeve. "It's coming," she whispered, her voice trembling. Evan turned to see the shadow of the helper stretching across the wall, its grotesque form illuminated by the dim light. His eyes darted around the room, searching for anything he could use. A rusted pipe leaned against a nearby cage, its surface slick with grime. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. He grabbed the pipe, positioning himself between the girl and the approaching monster. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice low but firm. The helper emerged from the shadows, its hunched frame towering over them. Its eyes, small, beady, and unervingly human, fixed on Evan with unbridled rage. Its mouth opened in a grotesque snarl, revealing rows of jagged yellow teeth. Evan swung the pipe as hard as he could, aiming for its head. The impact sent a jolt up his arms, but the helper barely flinched. It swatted the pipe aside with a clawed hand, sending Evan stumbling backward. The girl screamed as the creature lunged toward them, its massive hands reaching out. Evan dodged, barely avoiding its grasp, and swung the pipe again, this time aiming for its knees. The creature let out a guttural cry, momentarily dropping to one side. "Go. Run," Evan shouted, shoving the girl toward the corner of the room. "I'm not leaving you," she cried, tears streaming down her face. "You have to," he yelled, his voice breaking. The helper recovered quickly, its rage now focused entirely on Evan. It charged at him, its claws slashing through the air. Evan ducked and rolled, narrowly avoiding a blow that would have torn him apart. The girl hesitated, her small frame trembling. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Evan saw her dart toward a control panel mounted on the wall. "What are you doing?" he shouted, his voice laced with panic. "I can open the door," she cried, her fingers flying across the buttons. Evan's heart leapt with a mixture of hope and dread. The helper snarled and lunged toward the girl, but Evan intercepted it, swinging the pipe with all his strength. The blow connected with its shoulder, forcing it to turn its attention back to him. "Come on," Evan muttered under his breath, gripping the pipe tightly. "You want me? Come get me." The creature obliged, its massive form bearing down on him with terrifying speed. Evan braced himself, knowing he couldn't keep this up for long. Behind him, the sound of grinding metal filled the air as the steel door began to slide open. "I got it," the girl screamed. "Hurry." Evan made a split-second decision. He dodged the helper's next attack and sprinted toward the girl, grabbing her hand as they bolted through the opening. The door groaned and began to close behind them, but the helper wasn't far behind. They threw themselves through the gap just as the door slammed shut, the creature's enraged howl muffled by the thick steel. Evan collapsed to the ground, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. The girl clung to him, sobbing uncontrollably. "Are we safe?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Evan didn't answer. He wasn't sure. The corridor they found themselves in was narrow and dimly lit, the walls slick with moisture and decay. Evan's grip on the girl's hand tightened as he forced himself to stand. Every muscle in his body screamed in protest, but they had to keep moving. "Come on," he said hoarsely, his voice barely above a whisper. The girl nodded, wiping her tear-streaked face with trembling hands. Their footsteps echoed ominously as they walked, each step a reminder of how deep they were in this labyrinth of horrors. Evan kept glancing over his shoulder, half expecting the steel door to burst open and unleash the helper once more. "Do you think there's another way out?" the girl asked, her voice quivering. "There has to be," Evan replied, though he didn't believe it himself. "We just have to keep going." The corridor twisted and turned, splitting off into smaller passages that looked equally uninviting. Evan chose their path at random, guided by nothing more than instinct and desperation. After what felt like hours, they came to a larger room. Unlike the others, this one was eerily quiet, its air heavy with an unnatural stillness. Rows of monitors lined the walls, each screen flickering with grainy footage. Evan approached cautiously, his eyes scanning the screens. Most showed empty corridors, but a few displayed rooms like the one they had escaped, filled with cages and restrained figures. "This is how they watch everything," he muttered, his stomach turning at the realization. "Can we use it?" the girl asked, her voice hopeful. Evan hesitated. The thought of touching anything connected to this place filled him with dread, but it might be their only chance. He stepped closer, examining the control panel beneath the monitors. It was covered in switches, buttons, and a keyboard with faded keys. "Let's see," he said, his fingers hovering over the controls. He began pressing buttons at random, hoping to find something useful. The screens flickered and changed, showing new angles and locations. One screen caught his attention, a room filled with equipment that looked like it belonged in a high-tech lab. More importantly, there was a door in the background, marked with the word "Exit" in bold red letters. "There," he said, pointing to the screen. "Can we get there?" the girl asked, her eyes wide with a mix of hope and fear. "I think so," Evan replied, studying the layout. "If we can find this hallway, it should lead us to that door." He memorized the details of the screen, the path, the turns, anything that could guide them. Then he turned to the girl. "Stay close to me. No matter what happens, don't let go." She nodded, her small hand gripping his tightly. They left the surveillance room and followed the path Evan had memorized. The tension was unbearable, every shadow and sound a potential threat. As they moved deeper into the labyrinth, the air grew colder, and the walls seemed to close in around them. Finally, they turned a corner and saw the hallway from the monitor. The exit door loomed at the end, its red sign glowing like a beacon. "We're almost there," Evan said, his voice barely hiding his relief. But as they approached, a low, guttural growl echoed from behind them. Evan froze, his blood running cold. The girl squeezed his hand. "It's back," she whispered, her voice trembling. Evan turned to see the helper emerging from the shadows, its grotesque form illuminated by the dim light. Its beady eyes locked onto them, filled with unrelenting rage. "Run!" Evan shouted, pushing the girl forward. They sprinted toward the door, the creature's heavy footsteps thundering behind them. Evan reached the door first and threw it open, shoving the girl through. "Go," he yelled. "Keep running." The girl hesitated for a moment, then bolted down the corridor beyond. Evan turned to face the helper, his body blocking the doorway. The creature lunged at him, its claws slashing through the air. Evan dodged and grabbed a metal rod lying nearby, swinging it with all his strength. The impact stunned the creature for a moment, but it quickly recovered, its rage only intensifying. Evan knew he couldn't hold it off for long. With a final, desperate effort, he swung the rod again, aiming for the creature's head. The blow connected and the creature stumbled backward. Evan seized the moment to slip through the door, slamming it shut behind him. He turned the lock, his hands shaking, and collapsed against the wall. The girl was waiting a few feet away, her face pale and her eyes filled with tears. "Is it over?" she asked. Evan shook his head, his chest heaving. "Not yet." Evan stood for a moment, catching his breath, before pulling the girl to her feet again. The corridor stretched ahead, brighter than the maze-like hallways they had traversed. It was lined with broken decorations, cracked ornaments, snapped candy canes, and torn red fabric that might have once been part of a cheerful Christmas display. "Stay close," he murmured, glancing over his shoulder. The muffled banging on the locked door behind them spurred them forward. The creature wasn't giving up, and Evan had no illusions about the durability of the barrier. As they moved further down the corridor, the oppressive atmosphere began to shift. The air was sharp with the acrid scent of burnt plastic, mixed with something sweeter, like caramelized sugar that had been left to scorch. Ahead, a faint hum resonated, mechanical and rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat. The girl tugged on his sleeve. "What is that sound?" Evan's stomach tightened. "I don't know, but we need to keep moving." The corridor opened into a cavernous room, and what they saw stopped them in their tracks. The center of the room was dominated by a grotesque assembly line, its mechanical arms twitching and whirring with precise movements. Pieces of fabric, wood, and metal were being welded, sewn, and shaped into twisted facsimiles of Christmas toys. But the details were wrong. A doll's eyes were replaced with pinhole cameras. A toy train emitted a low, static buzz instead of a whistle. It was clear now, this wasn't just about torture and control. Someone or something was creating tools of surveillance and manipulation, all hidden behind the facade of holiday cheer. "This must be where they make the presents," Evan muttered, his voice thick with disgust. "They're watching everything," the girl whispered, her gaze locked on the cameras mounted above the assembly line. Evan followed her line of sight. Each camera was wired to a console at the far end of the room, where a cluster of monitors displayed live feeds of homes, streets, and even what looked like children's bedrooms. He clenched his fists. The idea of a monstrous Santa and its twisted network was horrifying enough, but this invasion of privacy, this exploitation, it was unforgivable. "We have to stop this," he said, his voice steady now. The girl looked at him with wide eyes. "How? There are cameras everywhere. They'll see us." Evan's mind raced. "We destroy the system. If we can take out the main console, maybe we can shut it all down." The girl hesitated but nodded. "Okay. What do we do?" Evan scanned the room, his gaze settling on a rusted fire extinguisher mounted on the wall. He grabbed it, testing its weight, and then turned to the girl. "Stay behind me. If anything comes out, run. Don't look back, just go." She nodded again, her small frame trembling. Evan approached the console cautiously, the extinguisher raised like a weapon. The monitors flickered, their feeds shifting to static and back again. As he drew closer, the hum of the machinery grew louder, almost deafening. Just as he reached the console, a deep, guttural laugh echoed through the room. It wasn't human, low and raspy like metal grinding against stone. "Do you really think you can stop this?" The voice came from nowhere and everywhere, surrounding them. Evan's heart pounded as he searched for the source. The shadows near the far corner of the room shifted, and a figure stepped into the dim light. It was dressed in a tattered red suit, its beard streaked with grime and its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. Santa. But this wasn't the jolly, mythical figure from childhood stories. This was something darker, something ancient and cruel, wearing the guise of innocence. "You've come so far," the figure said, its voice dripping with mockery. "But you're too late. The network is already in place. The world belongs to us now." Evan didn't respond. He gripped the fire extinguisher tighter, his mind focused on one thing, destroying the console. "Go," he shouted to the girl. "Find another way out." She hesitated for a moment, then turned and ran, her footsteps fading into the distance. The figure moved closer, its twisted grin widening. "Do you think smashing a few machines will change anything? You're just one man against an empire." Evan didn't answer. He swung the extinguisher with all his strength, bringing it down on the console. Sparks flew and the monitors shattered, their feeds cutting to black. The figure roared, its voice shaking the room. "You'll pay for that." Evan swung again and again, dismantling the machinery until the hum ceased, leaving an eerie silence. But Santa wasn't finished. The figure lunged at him, its claws outstretched. Evan barely dodged, the creature's swipe grazing his shoulder. He grabbed a jagged piece of metal from the wreckage and turned to face the creature. "If this is your empire, then I'll burn it to the ground." Evan held the jagged piece of metal tightly, his knuckles white as the monstrous Santa stalked closer. The room seemed to warp and pulse with every step the creature took, its twisted form illuminated by the flickering sparks from the ruined console. Despite his fear, Evan stood his ground. This was no longer about survival, it was about ensuring no one else would ever suffer under this nightmare again. "You think you've won?" the creature snarled, its grin spreading unnaturally wide. You've only destroyed one piece of the puzzle. The network is vast, boy. I am everywhere. Evan swallowed the lump in his throat, his breathing uneven. Maybe, he said, his voice steady despite the chaos around him, but you're here now. And I'll make sure you're not everywhere for much longer. With a guttural roar, the creature charged, its claws slashing through the air. Evan barely had time to react, sidestepping and thrusting the jagged metal forward. The improvised weapon tore through the fabric of its filthy red coat, embedding into something solid and unnatural beneath. Instead of blood, a thick, black ichor oozed from the wound, hissing as it hit the ground. The creature didn't falter. It grabbed Evan by the wrist with a vice-like grip, lifting him off the ground with terrifying ease. "You're persistent," it growled, its glowing eyes narrowing. "But persistence won't save you." Evan gritted his teeth, ignoring the searing pain in his arm. With his free hand, he grabbed a shard of broken glass from the console wreckage and slashed at the creature's face. The blow landed, and for the first time the creature recoiled, dropping him to the floor with a howl of rage. He scrambled to his feet, panting. The creature's face was partially torn, revealing something metallic and inhuman beneath the facade. Sparks flickered from the exposed area, and the room seemed to shudder as the creature's laugh echoed once more. "You're starting to understand," it said, its voice now distorted, crackling like static. "I'm not a man. I'm not even a being. I'm an idea woven into the fabric of this world. You can't kill an idea." Evan's gaze darted around the room, searching for anything he could use. His eyes fell on the assembly line, still packed with the grotesque toys and surveillance devices. An idea struck him, a desperate, dangerous idea. "If I can't kill you," he said, his voice low, "then I'll bury you." Before the creature could react, Evan sprinted to the assembly line and grabbed a heavy, industrial tool, a wrench large enough to crush bone. He swung it wildly at the machinery, sparks flying as he smashed gears, severed cables, and overturned entire sections of the line. The room began to shake violently. Alarms blared, and a deep, guttural groan echoed from the walls, as if the building itself were alive and in pain. The creature roared, lunging toward him, but Evan was ready. He ducked under its swipe and swung the wrench with all his strength, connecting with the side of its head. The creature stumbled, sparks shooting from its exposed machinery. "You can't stop this," it bellowed, its voice glitching and breaking. "The network will rebuild. You're nothing." Evan didn't respond. He grabbed a container of volatile chemicals from a nearby shelf, likely used for manufacturing the grotesque toys, and hurled it into the heart of the assembly line. The liquid ignited on contact with the exposed wiring, flames erupting and spreading rapidly. The creature let out a distorted scream, its form flickering and glitching like a corrupted video file. The heat intensified, and Evan backed away, shielding his face from the flames. "You can destroy this place," the creature said, its voice fading, "but you can't destroy me. I'll find another way." Evan stared at the burning monstrosity, his expression grim. "Not if I can help it." As the flames consumed the machinery, the room's structure began to collapse. Smoke filled the air, and the walls groaned under the strain. Evan turned and ran, his lungs burning and his vision blurred. He found the girl waiting near the exit, her face pale but determined. "Come on," she shouted, pulling him toward the door. They burst out into the freezing night, coughing and gasping for air as the building behind them crumbled. Flames shot into the sky, illuminating the dark landscape. Evan collapsed to his knees, his body trembling with exhaustion. The girl knelt beside him, her small hand resting on his shoulder. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Evan stared at the burning wreckage, his mind replaying the creature's final words. He didn't know if it was over, if something as vast and insidious as this network could ever truly be destroyed. But for now, the immediate threat was gone. "Yeah," he said finally, his voice heavy with weariness. "It's over." As the flames began to die down, Evan and the girl sat in silence, the weight of what they had survived settling over them. Whatever came next, they would face it together.